Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach, and on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the cycle of generational trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, death and cupcakes. Yes, my dear, we are talking about death. As a regular listener, you probably remember my friend Christy Lorisella. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She's been on the podcast many times. For the past few years, she kept asking me about doing an episode on death. I was resentful at first, then I was reluctant. I had reservations. I didn't want to turn off my listeners. And quite frankly, I myself didn't want to dive deep into this topic. Then I agreed. But it's not gloomy or morbid. I promise you. In fact, I might say it turned out better than I expected. It's insightful, thought-provoking, helpful, and I dare to say enjoyable. Plus, you'll discover how I want to die. No, not really. No. To lighten the mood and ease me into the conversation, Christy had brought cupcakes with her and delightfully announced that she thought of a title for this episode, hence Death and Cupcakes. With Christy, there are always sharp jokes, good laughs, and lightheartedness. Step into my living room where Christy and I had this conversation face to face over coffee and imagine that you are with us. Please enjoy. Well, you wanted to talk about this topic. I think you should start. I am here. I agreed to be here.
Well, I guess the first thing that I wanted to say, I have a completely different experience and relationship with death than you do. I mean, I feel like I need to say that from the onset. You experienced an enormous amount of loss early on in your life that I just didn't experience, and I think I've experienced very typical losses in my life. And I just felt like that needed to be, honored, that your experience is unique. You bring different perspective to it.
The moment you said, let's do this podcast about death, I mean, you've been saying this for years, right? Since I started the podcast, you're like, when are we going to talk about death in a joking manner? But the last time we met, I finally gave in. I said, you know what? This girl is not going to give up. I have to say yes. But I'm going to surprise you because the moment I said yes to the podcast idea, obviously I started reflecting about this topic. And I have some notes. And the first thing I realized is I don't have a lot of experience with death. Loss, yes. But actual death, no. I feel like these are very different ideas. And in fact, yes, I saw a lot of carnage, the earthquake, the disaster, the rubble, everything that came during, after, and many years after, all the struggles and the bad things. But I haven't seen much death. I've experienced death. People have disappeared from my life. And most people that I lost, and I lost a lot of people, right? So from the earthquake time when I was 13, like in those 12 seconds, I lost my mom, my cousin, my aunt, my neighbors, my friends, my classmates, my teachers, like a lot of people. But I didn't witness their death, right? I didn't go to my mom's funeral. I haven't seen her dead. I haven't seen her body. And for many years, I held on to a fantasy that she may appear one day because I hadn't seen her dead body. Then I don't have my grandparents, both sets. Obviously, my dad, I wasn't there when he died. My grandparents, the only dead people I have seen in my life, and I have lost my uncles. My mom had 4 other siblings and only one of them is alive. So, and from my father's side too. And there were so many important people in my life post-earthquake who guided me, neighbor women and lovely people who are also not alive. So while I experienced a lot of loss, I only saw my paternal grandfather in a coffin, dead, and participated in the funeral ceremony and all of that, and my maternal grandmother, dead in a coffin, open face, just like the Armenians do. I think other than that, I don't have an actual experience of being with the dying person, being by their bedside table, asking them questions, seeing how they go. And I feel like that's such an important and good life experience, right? But my experiences of loss and death have always been shock deaths. Everything that I lost, I couldn't go to their funerals. My grandma, all of those people that I mentioned. And so I don't know what to make of death. That's my story. Yeah, loss and grief. Yes, I have lots of experience. But I feel like death is a completely different thing for me.
And I feel like what you're talking about is the natural dying process. That's really what you're referring to, right? Just like you've experienced traumatic loss, sudden loss, and really, what we're talking about here today pertains more to like having the space and luxury to actually contemplate death and be with it and sit with the idea of it, sit with someone who may be dying or who will die. And I think that, at least in America, those experiences are really, in a way, taken from us by how we kind of shove death into a hospital room or into behind a closed door. And we don't really consider it a very natural part of the circle of life. And therefore, a lot of us haven't witnessed the magic and the mystery.
The mystery. For me, it's the mystery, right? Death equals mystery for me. And I want to keep it that way, right? Have you experienced a lot of death the way I was talking about?
Well, I think...
Not maybe a lot, but have you witnessed death?
I think as a hospice and palliative care social worker, I witnessed death and dying in a very clinical setting. And a lot of those instances, the person was, very comfortable and surrounded by loved ones, and they died exactly the way they wanted to. Personally, I've been with my dying grandparents. 3 of my 4 grandparents I was able to visit with. I was not with them for their exact moment of death, but in the hours, days preceding.
And what was like for you, that experience? Are you grateful for that experience now?
For sure. I think that experience, I became very consumed with learning about death when my grandfather was dying, and he was a person who was totally cognitively with it until the end. And he was also a person who I loved very deeply and felt very close to. And having watched my mom care for him throughout his later years and watch her navigate his decline and her mother's decline, her mother died a few years later, I was experiencing all this loss within months of giving birth to my son. And so it was I think I was primed because I had just experienced childbirth and the magnitude of that experience. And then to witness the deaths of 3 of my grandparents within months of giving birth, I was able to really see the parallels of those experiences. Kind of like the helplessness that you can feel around it, the unpredictability of it, not wanting anyone to suffer, not wanting to suffer myself. And it was just a very kind of unifying experience for me. And that was where I became determined, like, okay, my grandfather is going to die. I need to be okay with this. And that was when I started reading a lot about death. And that's actually what led me to go back to school and become a social worker, specifically a hospice social worker, so I've kind of run towards the mystery of death in order to kind of force myself to be able to sit with it.
It's interesting. As you know, I belong to a book club. I sort of run the book club. And recently I did a poll, right? We have lots of book ideas. And in order to vote which book we want to read next or the next month, I asked all the book club members to submit ideas so I can create a Google form and everybody can vote anonymously, and we can read the synopsis of the book beforehand. And there were 2 books. One of them I suggested was The 5 Regrets of the Dying. And another book, I can't remember the name, but it's also about death and fear of this culture of being death phobic. And so those 2 books are about death and dying. And people in the book club, it's different ages. There are people in their 70s, 80s, 60s. I'm on the younger side in the book club, but these are elderly people predominantly in the book club. And the 2 books, and I had options. Yes, I would like to read this. No, I'm not interested. The 2 books that got no, I'm not interested were the 2 books about death and dying. The votes, the majority, 100%, no one wants to read those books. You're not surprised? I'm not surprised. Nobody wants to talk about it. I don't have a problem talking about it. Like, I'm not scared of death per se, right? We're all gonna die. I am not scared of that idea. It's a fact of life. And sometimes I contemplate about it, or it actually helps me to treat my uncle or my aunt, be more caring towards them and call them more frequently because I know they are not here forever. And so it helps me. Obviously, I'm not aware of death all the time and you can't be, right? We have to have this illusion to get up and go on with our days. But I think I am more aware of it than maybe your average person. And I don't mind. I'm comfortable with it. But my fear is of the dying process, as I told you last time. I know that I'm not scared of death, but I am scared of the pain and the struggle and cognitive decline and physical decline, all of those possibilities that can happen. Like you can get cancer and die within a month or so. Like, I don't want that. Like, I'm scared of that premature death. I do want to live as much as God has given me, let's say, but I don't want to die prematurely. That's my fear of dying, of the way of dying, not the death itself.
Yeah, of course. I think that's very typical. And I think that, you kind of mentioned a health issue that can bring about death. People can also just die of old age. And that's something that we rarely get to see. It typically folks age and then go from one health crisis to the next and then to the last health crisis and are treated very medically throughout. And it's my perspective that I think if we can talk about death more and we can talk about our fears around it and learn more about it and about what death looks like here in the United States, in New Jersey specifically, I think there's less to fear. That's my perspective. Like when I'm afraid of something, if I learn more about it, I typically kind of can tame that beast in my head, like because I have more information. I guess it can also work opposite. Like you can then learn about things to worry about that you hadn't ever thought of before.
I think that's the case for me. For me, I don't want to touch death. I know I'm going to die. I don't want to think about it or talk about it. Like, what's there to talk about? We're going to die. Let me enjoy and live my life right now. Because sometimes I find myself looking in the mirror. I'm like, what if today is the last day of my life? And it gives me a sense of panic in that very moment. I'm like, I'm home alone. Something could happen to me right now. I'm almost 50, right? And that just gives me this really terrible sense of, oh my gosh, I don't want to think about that. Have you read that book, The Measure? So that was in our book club, we read that book. So basically, it's a novel, it's a fiction. So everybody in the world, in whatever world that story happens, gets up in the morning and everybody finds a box. Every person above 22 finds a box on their doorstep. And in that box, there is a string, either short or long. And that determines the length of your life, the short stringers and the long stringers. It's an interesting concept. The book is like a bestseller and every book club is reading. The main thing is, and there are, I think 6 characters in the book. Some decide to open their box to know, some decide not to. So in a book club, the common question was, would you want to know the size of your string? And I was in the minority of people who said, no, I don't want to open my box to know whether my string is short or long. Because But a lot of people were in opposition. They were, no, if I know the length of my life, the length of my string, then I can craft a life based on that. If it's a long life, then it can give me relief and I can have a happy life. If it's short, then I can decide to squeeze in the things that I want to do. And, that was their mentality. To me, I like the mystery of it. I don't want to know the length of my string. Even if I get cancer, I don't want to know how much I have to live. I wouldn't want to know that.
That's interesting.
Would you want to know if you got that box? Would you open it?
No, I mean, that's life. Like, that's our life now. We have the box and we can't open it. So we don't have the option. And so you have to figure out what is going to be your motivation every day, And for me, even just like changing careers and going back to grad school and thinking about like, oh my gosh, this is going to take me so many years to get to a point where I want to be. But like one of the big things that got me through was, oh my gosh, if I am going to die when I'm 50, I want to do this. This is something that makes my life richer and fuller. And even if I only get 5 years of an amazing career that I always wanted to try, that will have been worth it. So I kind of operate on that premise that I never know. You know what I mean? I feel fortunate to wake up every day and I try to live in a way, to not have regrets and to leave off with people who I love, in a good way each time I leave them and say the things that I want to say to them on a regular basis and be open about my feelings with them. These are things that I would want to do if I were given a very short prognosis, like a terrible disease prognosis where somebody said you have weeks to live. What would I do?
Would you change anything about your life?
Yeah. I mean, yes and no. I mean, I guess I would probably indulge a little bit more. But I mean, I think maybe the thing that would change the most would be, the amount of quality time that I spend with people who I love, and the types of maybe activities we do together. But I think because I've been in the healthcare industry now for so long, and I think I'm pretty frequently close in touch with that part of life that, this is a beautiful weekend ahead of me, and how do I want to spend that time? Yes, there are practical things that need to get done, but this is time off with my family, and how can we have a lovely experience with this time that we have in front of us?
So doctor, author, podcaster Peter Attia has this calendar. It has the weeks of an average person's lifespan, 40,000 weeks. And each week he marks off of that calendar that one more week passed from his own life. So this is this visual reminder for him that life is short, it's finite, and it gives him motivation. He says it's really, it's working for him. Would you want to have a calendar like that?
I guess it's a good reminder. I don't know if I'd want to be looking at it every day, but it's an interesting concept.
Yeah.
I think about death so often, and I read about death so much that I don't need that calendar.
What do you think about it? Like, share with me, because I don't think about it. I put it aside. It's in the back of my mind. I am aware of it, but I don't think about it.
Well, this is probably a good spot for me to share. I don't know why. When I was thinking about this conversation, I was taken back to a memory that I have as a child. And I know I did this a lot. I would be in bed in the dark by myself, and I must have been like 7-ish. And I know this is developmentally appropriate for that age, but I was like thinking about infinity, thinking about heaven, what it actually is out there. And I must have learned something in school science about infinity and stars and stars and stars. And I would just lay there and just try to like envision the end of the universe. And I just have this very vivid memory of that, and like tears like just like streaming down my face, not crying, just being like so overwhelmed by this concept. And I just always been a weirdo like that. Like, and I think when the reason why I'm bringing that up is because that's kind of like the mystery of death and like what's beyond that. And even like kind of on the other end of the spectrum of that, like having been a birth doula and witnessed the births of many babies, I also think about what comes before that too. It's a very similar type of mystery to me. Like, where are we before we arrive, and where do we go when we're gone?
To the same place. I think we're like, I'm not religious. Like, I don't believe in God, that it's a person up there with a white beard and things like that. But I'm a spiritual person. I was at a retreat one day and somebody asked a question, like we were outside. I remember this. They said, hey, what do you want to turn into when you die? And my first answer, like without thinking, it was light. And I was like, wow, like, why did I say that? I thought about that for a while. I feel like we're consciousness, right? We're part of that consciousness. We turn into that consciousness. We come from that consciousness. We die and that's what I believe. I mean, I don't believe, where do you go when you die? I don't know if there's a place that people go, but like, sometimes when I was a kid, I would imagine what would happen if I die. Like, I want to know, but I want to come back. I would like to know what it's like when you die, where you go, what happens, but I also want to come back with that knowledge. And partly that's because one of my uncles, my mom's brothers, he was 40 something years old and he had a clinical death. So that was talked about in my family a lot. And I was a kid. So he came back a different person. He had amazing, extraordinary abilities after that. He could clairvoyancy, like he had skills like that after that clinical death. So I was intrigued by that idea. But yeah, so I don't know where people go.
Yeah, I think if you have a specific religion or faith that always includes some type of, prescribed explanation for what happens after death, whether it be reincarnation or heaven or what have you. I think we are all talking about the same thing, just using different words, right? Somebody's heaven is what you're saying is your light that's everywhere, And I mean, for me, it's more of like when my grandfather died and when my husband's mother died, especially, like there was like this, like a electricity, like a love energy that I felt very strongly, and that it comes and goes. And I mean, I guess that's kind of getting into like supernatural stuff. But to me, I think there's, it's when we spend our lives cultivating relationships and being loving and being creative and that really resonates for long after we die, and that's energy going, kind of staying around.
It's so interesting, like we're jumping from point to point, but I had a classmate in college and her father died one day and it was a very curious experience. She didn't know about his death, but the clock in her house stopped at that very moment when he was dead somewhere else in a different town. And I've heard of those kind of accounts before. I don't know, is that energy? Is that...
Alex and I had a similar experience with his mom. She had a physical disability towards the end of her life. There was no way to know that she was going to die. And this was when Zan was little, like 6 months old, and she hadn't met him yet. She lived in Alabama, and I just had this overwhelming feeling. We need to go see her mom. We didn't have money for airfare, so we jumped in the car. We talked about it. We jumped in the car with our 6-month-old and drove to Alabama. It wasn't fun, but it was like we were excited. She was going to meet her grandson for the first time, and we surprised her, and it was an amazing visit. We were with her for a week. She held our son the whole week. She was so happy, and she was doing good. And 3 weeks later, she died suddenly. And like we hadn't seen her for years. And it was like there was something that told me there was this magical thing that we're so grateful that idea came to us and we followed through with it.
Oh, I know so many stories like that, many, many stories. And I remember that when my grandfather passed away, I was in 10th grade. So as I said, Armenians have this open casket custom. And my grandfather was... there was a small house adjacent to the main house. Well, after the earthquake, it was just a shelter type of place. So his body was there and mourners are there. So there are traditional things people do. And I think they keep the body there for 3 days and they bury him on the 3rd day. And so during the 3 days, people come and visit, people grieve, cry, and people take turns to stay with the body at night and things like that. And so I remember, and obviously you notify all the relatives, right, to come. And my grandfather's sister's son lived in Georgia, and that's the family that took care of us after the earthquake. They took the 13 of us to their home and took care of us. So they were important people. And I remember adults talking about this, that, my grandfather's one eye was not completely closed off while he was dead. The moment that person walked in, he just, he shut his eye. Everybody was like talking about that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's like very eerie, right? But I heard so many stories like that, throughout my life.
Well, your country as well has a tradition in the days and weeks and months following death as well that we don't have here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole culture. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, which I think lends itself to being more comfortable with.
I think
death.
Yes, I think it is. Yes, there's a lot of customs. People get together, obviously, after the funeral. The day after the funeral, there are ceremonies. The 7th day there are things people do. The 14th day, then there is the 40th day. And I believe after the 40th day is the year. And then every year after the New Year's, you go to the graveside. Like there are holidays and customs. It's woven into the fabric of life. Yeah. And I think it makes the grieving process a lot easier. The togetherness, the gathering, talking, sharing, grew up with that. And it makes it a lot bearable. When you grieve in community, you feel held and witnessed, and you offer the same for others. I already mentioned a bunch of things in our conversation, but point number 5 is my parents' attitude towards death. So what do I mean by that? It's like both of my parents, my mom especially, like she was 35 when she died, right? But she was talking about death and stuff like that. I remember hearing conversations like that. And then my dad, before he passed, in March, there is a video of him, a short video my cousin sent me that year in New Year's or some holiday. I guess they are at the table eating and celebrating something. And then my father, people say toasts in Armenia when they eat, and those toasts are usually meaningful. They open a deeper conversation. They basically say, let's drink for friendship, let's say. And there's a whole conversation about that. So toasts are really not just for drinking, but deepening the conversation, deepening the tides of the evening. As they get deeper, they drink, I don't know, and there is a whole culture around this. The first toast has to be for this, the second is for that, third is, I don't know any of this, and then you drink for the parents, for love, that kind of stuff. And so my dad says a toast. I don't hear the toast part, but the recording is, he talks about death, how natural it is to die, and that it's the natural order of things, and that when it's time, we go. And the way he talks about it, like it's literally 2 months before he dies. He talks about this and he wrote poems about it. Like literally a few months before he died, my dad was a poet. He read me a poem, he said, and he rarely read his poems to us, right? Especially like out loud. Maybe he would have given it to us to read, but he never read it to us. One day I remember he read a poem to me over the phone. Basically, the idea of the poem is, when I die, don't bring flowers to my grave. And like it seems like he knew something, And when we were in Armenia, and like my whole family went, people who are overseas, we went to do a ceremony for my dad, a memorial. We went to the grave, and it's very customary for Armenians to buy flowers to bring to the grave. I said, no, people, we're not going to buy flowers because, I want to honor my father's wish. That's what he said. Don't bring flowers to my grave. So that's like, I heard him speak about death, and I used to play that clip, that video over and over. I'm like, wow, why is he so confident and comfortable about this? It seemed like he didn't have fear about it. He was okay with it. He probably thought a lot about it, Yeah. So that's that. That reminds me of, you had that, you didn't know it at the time, but when he was reading you that poem, he was sharing something with you about his thoughts on death. And I think it is such a privilege to be able to have heard those words from him. Yeah.
Because not everybody has the same desires, around what they imagine their death to be like and what they want to occur when they die. And if we don't talk about it, then we never find out.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about it.
It was really courageous of him to share that with you.
Yeah. Well, one question I always have that bothers me a lot is, does the person who is dying know when they are about to die? Are they aware of that moment? Or do the lights just go like that out and it's done? Or is it the process? The reason I'm saying this is sharpened for me this idea after my father's death again, because I read the autopsy report, right? And it said in there, I think I mentioned this in our podcast episode when we did it together, and it said in there, his death began 2 days prior to March 25th. And that was the day I spoke with him. Remember, I think I mentioned this, that his voice was coming from a different place. I did not recognize my dad's voice. It was from this deep hole, like it was different. And my aunt says the same thing. And she talked to him after, during those 2 days, which I hadn't. Only one day I spoke with him. And so my question is, like, do you know in that moment, like, let's say you're ill, you're in the hospital, even with that knowledge that you're going to die, death is already by your doorstep. When that moment comes, is there awareness of that?
I mean, I think if you're open to it, there is. I mean, it also depends clinically what's going on with you, right? Some people are in a coma and they die. You're saying, do they have the consciousness in that state to know that they're dying? Or, I mean, I know you're not asking me for an answer.
No, I mean, it's a rhetorical, mysterious question I am just putting out there.
But I think, I mean, that reminds me of the book that I just read not that long ago, written by Pema Chodron, the Buddhist nun, How We Live is How We Die. And I mean, it's a beautiful book, and I found it to be very informative and comforting. She does talk a lot about specifically Buddhist beliefs on death, but she also talks about how we live day to day is how we're going to die. So I think if you live in denial and refuse to acknowledge reality around you, then you're probably going to be in that state when you're dying. It's, if you're open to mystery, if you're willing to talk about hard stuff, then that aspect of your personality will shape your dying process. That's what I think.
Well, here is a note in my notebook. This one is quite interesting. And I have so many points. This is point number 13. I guess I've been thinking about this ever since you asked me about this topic. Every day I had a new idea. I was thinking about it. Point number 13 is, I have been thinking I have been to more funerals than births. The only birth actually I have been to is my child's birth. Isn't that interesting? And literally my own, yeah. No. And I think death is similar. Like you were talking about, remember that woman, Amy Glenn? She was a guest on my podcast way back in 2015. Maybe I should have her back. She's wonderful.
She wrote Birth, Breath, Death.
Breath. Is that how it is, the title? Birth, breath, and death.
And then that's one of her
I love
books.
That title. Yeah, she's a birth doula and a death doula, right? I love that title. She, thinking about this, I was thinking about that title. And here is point number 14. I don't want to poke around this topic. I don't want to tinker with this. I'm not superstitious, it says. Yeah.
I mean, I could jump in here because having worked in the hospital as a palliative care and hospice social worker through the pandemic, I saw a lot of death. I saw a lot of suffering. And because of that experience, I have a pretty strong bias about this. Because if you don't know and don't want to know, then this is in terms of having medical issues. If you don't know your prognosis and you don't want to know, then how can you possibly make decisions about your care?
Yeah, I think the decisions about care, they're important. As I'm getting older, I realize that that's an important aspect. All of those deaths happened to me very sudden, right? And I never had to take care of things because of that, the earthquake, people just took care of things. I was a kid, my dad's death, obviously, my cousins and my uncle, everybody took care of things. But I want to take care of my own things. I don't want to leave that burden to my child, decision making, to do a cremation or a burial. Where to bury Anna Seewald? In Armenia or in the United States, right? These are big questions. What to do with belongings? If I'm a vegetable in that state, I don't want to be kept alive. I have wishes. So I do want to think about those things. But I don't think they are related to the death the way I think about the death. You know what I mean? Those are like practical things I can think about, take care of. I sort of see those as two separate things.
When can you take care of them?
Well, I think as soon as possible, even now. Like we have made already, obviously my husband is an attorney. We have wills and stuff like that. If something happens to us, who's going to take care of our daughter? Do you have that kind of plan in place? So we do too.
But even that is hard to get some folks to do.
Yes. I think people don't want to think about
especially
that.
when you have children, it's a huge responsibility. And I know so many of your listeners are parents, but I would strongly, strongly recommend to people that they think very seriously about who they would want to care for their children if, God forbid, they went out on a date night and didn't come home. Because that happens rarely, but it happens. And, it's really important to have people who know that they're the ones that you want to take care of your children.
Yeah.
And have it in writing.
Have it in writing.
Because if it's not in writing, it's very hard it makes it much harder and a much longer process.
Oh, yeah, believe me. There's, the courts get involved and things like that. So you do want to take care of that as a parent. I think it's a responsible thing to do. It's not like, oh, I'm not going to die. I don't want to think about that. Like we have that fear, but it's a very responsible thing to do. And you need to, ask different people if they're willing to take that role. And a lot of times couples fight about this. Luckily, in my family, we were in agreement. My husband said, hey, do you want this person to be? I said, yeah, sure. And it happens to be my brother. Obviously, I'm going to say yes. So, but you have to ask them if they want to be responsible. And sometimes people can say no. So these are difficult conversations to think about and to really have. But I would encourage my listener, if they're going to take away something from this conversation, to really think about creating their wills and thinking about, all those other questions or, appointing people, a person, guardian, right? But that's important.
And also I'd like to throw in there designating healthcare proxies, especially if you're not married. If you're married, your default is your spouse in terms of if you're unable to make medical decisions for yourself, that your spouse legally is the next of kin. But, I'm sure you have listeners who are single parents or who are, not married, and that gets a little murky. And if you specifically know, if your sister is the person that is the best person to convey your wishes, then make sure you have that in writing. That's really important, having a healthcare proxy.
Yeah, I agree. Here I have some other points. It says, my first became aware of death when I was 4 years old because my maternal grandfather actually died in front of me. Did you know that? I didn't know at the time that was death or dying. He was a World War II veteran and he was imprisoned in Germany after the war for extra 5 years because he was a chef. So he was cooking for Germans. He was alive, but he was probably messed up, PTSD, and he came home. He struggled with alcoholism and stuff like that. Obviously, I was 4 years old. I don't know much about him. And I was thinking, wow, my mom was in her 20s. My mom had me when she was 21, so she was 25 years old. And I wish I could talk to my mom like now and say like, how was it for you to lose a parent that young? But my grandfather was sitting at the head of the table. I remember this memory vividly. I don't know if this is a real memory now that I'm thinking about it, but why would it be a made-up memory, right? As a 4-year-old, why would I make up a memory that he collapsed in front of me off his chair and hit his head on the floor, and after that he was gone? Mm-hmm. That was the death. I didn't participate in the funeral. I don't remember as a child or any other thing around that death, but I remember seeing that moment. So
well, and I imagine it was a story that was told as well. I mean, did people remark on it ever after it happened?
I don't remember anything. believe it or not.
That's quite a shocking way to go.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, I was thinking about that. See, this topic opened up a lot of things. Growing up in Armenia, obviously the books that we read, the fairy tales, the content, the movies we consume, at least when I was growing up, it wasn't happy Disney ending movies, happy Hollywood Disney movies. No. There was a lot of carnage and death and killing and, the Grimm brothers and I don't know, all sorts of books and stories we read. And I was exposed to the ideas. And I think it's important for children from a young age to be exposed to those ideas growing up in stories, in fairy tales, so that they can develop a schema in their mind, right, of those concepts. If we are shielding our children, if they're only seeing happy, beautiful, childhood, magical, glowy things, like that's not normal life. I am grateful for having read those books. I remember crying over books, having vivid memories and dreams even for, even after having witnessed a movie or something like that. So when I was 9, my mom was still reading aloud to us. And there was this book. Oh my gosh, it's such the saddest book written for children. To this day, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm okay with sad stories and dying, but that book is so brutal. Like, no, why did you write that, Jovanes Tumanyan? This book is really brutal. It just changed me as a person. And I think maybe it was too premature to read that book at age 9. But it's about the boy who has multiple siblings and the family is struggling. And his father, and I think he's like, I don't know, maybe 10 years old, this boy. His name is Gikor. And his father, by foot, takes him. It's in old ages. There's no cars or anything. There's horses, I guess. They by foot through the mountains. There's also the movie.
What's the name of this book?
Gikor. In fact, I saw it a couple of years ago as an adult, and I was messed up for like a week. I was crying nonstop. It's really sad. So, the father takes the little boy, who is the eldest of their 4 siblings, to Georgia, to the neighboring country of Armenia, where I went after the earthquake. Like, I was drawing parallels. And this little boy has to work for some master in his shop to make money and send the money to support the family. And this wealthy family who owns this store abuses this boy, basically. They make fun of him. They give him the worst living condition. They give him crumbs to eat. They mistreat him severely. And their spoiled children make fun of him.
It sounds a little Cinderella-ish.
But then he catches a cold one day, outside in the rain, and he gets pneumonia and he dies, and how they mistreat him even when he's dead, and how his father comes and just picks up the remainders and stuff. It's so sad. Really sad story. I remember my mom reading that story to us, and I would just go to the bathroom to cry about it. Like I was 9 years old, While I think it's important to talk about those things and read books, I think it has to be age appropriate also.
So was that a modern story, or was it like based on a fairy tale type of...
No, it's a, children's story. I don't know. It's a children's story. It's a book. It's a children's story. It is a modern, I think the author lived in the 1900s.
That sounds very devastating.
And I've seen the movie multiple times and the book, and it's just so sad.
Why are you drawn to watching the movie over and over? Like what?
No, I haven't watched it over and over. I watched it when I was a kid. They took us in school to an outing in school. I don't remember in what grade, but then I watched a movie I think during the pandemic, I'm going to say, because I was drawing parallels, like how I was in Georgia in my relatives' homes, but I was being mistreated. They weren't giving us food. Like I was starving and they were basically abusing me. I was like cleaning and doing chores for everyone.
Oh, wow. A lot of parallels.
So it was very similar. Yes, very similar. So I guess that story in some ways as a kid sort of prepared me, but that was I think it's interesting. I don't know what to think of it.
Now we're skipping to another topic after you just shared all that.
No, we're not skipping to another topic, but
that's heavy. That's so heavy, Anna. That's so heavy.
It is. Yeah. Yeah, that's a heavy story. And when I was 13 years old, I believe, maybe a little, no, not 13, sorry. When I became aware of a suicide. My mom knew this particular family, and I was always going along with my mom or with my grandma to places, and it wasn't child-centric. There were no play dates. We were going along with moms and grandmas to places, right? So I was always, chugging along. People would drink coffee and talk, and I was just sitting there. And I remember we were giving these people my childhood carriage, and their 13-year-old son had committed suicide, obviously. And I was hearing the adults talk about this. So I remember first time I became aware of that when I was like a kid. And there was another movie, a Russian movie, where a kid commits suicide and we see it on the screen. How about that? Yeah, like that haunted me for a long time. I still remember that particular scene.
Well, there's so much devastation around the world that I think in a lot of parts of the United States we're pretty sheltered from that. This is making me think about everything that's going on in the Middle East at the moment and a lot of death being televised. And
so, where do we go from here? You said you came with Cupcakes and you said, I know the title for this episode, Death and Cupcakes. And I'm going to name it that. After we finish this, we're going to eat cupcakes. But how shall we conclude this conversation? What's the takeaway for the listener? What do you want the listener to think about after this conversation?
Well, I guess a few things. I mean, this kind of a general meandering type of conversation about death. It feels like introduction kind of a conversation. I guess one thing is if someone who's listening to this, if this conversation resonates with them and they find themselves wanting to get to a place where they can be with dying and the concept of dying, of, that they maybe check out one of my book recommendations.
Oh, no, please. Yeah, I know you have 5 book recommendations. Go ahead. And you can still share your ideas. I feel like I spoke more, but this was your topic. This was your domain. Why did you want to have this conversation? And did our conversation meet your expectations? Are there things that you really wanted to say, but I didn't give you a chance?
No, I mean, I didn't really have a lot of expectations for our conversation. I was curious to see, where it would go. And
I just wanted to torture me. I know.
No,
I'm kidding.
No, I mean, I have a sense of death now that I didn't have, say, 10 years ago that, I don't know, I would like folks to have maybe more of an understanding of it and less fear of it. It's possible to, it's not that you want to die or you want anyone else to die, but that you can be with the dying and the impending loss without being in total fear, because I think if you're consumed with fear and upset at those times, you are, kind of missing out on an opportunity to be present to it and to potentially have less suffering for yourself or a loved one, potentially have really beautiful connection and conversation, prior to death. And I think that's like kind of my vision for wanting to talk about it so much, is because there can be beauty in the midst of the pain.
Yeah, I agree with that. And sometimes I feel like I am rubbed off of that. I've been rubbed off of that, even though I witnessed my grandfather's death and the funeral and my grandmother's. But again, I wasn't there when they died. I didn't have a chance to talk to them. I wish that those deaths could happen now when I'm so mature and wiser, not when I was younger. I didn't think about death then. Now I need to know because next is going to be me. So I do want to talk about it, ask them questions, the things that I wanted to know about them. And I feel like I don't have that opportunity. And sometimes people are like, you can still communicate with the person who departed and things like that. But it's not the same. I can talk to myself and say, Dad, what do you think about this? But I don't hear an echo or anything. And so I don't want to do that. I wish I had talked to my dad about things like that. So many questions I have about his life, his childhood, all the things that I talk about on the podcast. I am mature and ready now to have those conversations with my parents, but I don't have parents or grandparents, and it's so sad. I feel that I've been cheated off of something important, of that natural, beautiful thing in life. And I don't know.
Well, all the more reason. I mean, the other aspect of this, which could be a whole nother podcast episode, is more of like the informational, like medical component of death. You know, we've just like, I would argue, we've over-medicalized the birth process. We've also over-medicalized the death process, which is a very natural process. And I think, I mean, I certainly have a lot to say in that regard. And I think, you know, you're talking about kind of wishing you could do it over, you know, being more informed on the medical side of what death can look like is, you know, is a way to not live with regret when you're faced with a crisis. You know, I mean, a lot of times a health emergency can come up, a life-altering emergency. And if you're not prepared, then you're really making decisions really in the moment of crisis, which we all know our brain is just not really able to think.
Yes. I agree
right?
with that.
And so for me, you know, why I have nudged you to talk about death, and I mean, maybe get another episode out of you in another 10 years about death, but I do think it's important. And if your listeners are interested, I would certainly love to come back and talk more. Some of the books that I'm going to share with you to post on the website, you know, do specifically talk about kind of where medicine and death meet. And I really, I mean, I have some expertise in that field because of my work experience, but I think it allows folks to be proactive. And it does, you know, kind of temper some of the fears that we have.
Yeah. So what are the books?
So 3 of the books that are written by physicians. Dying Well, Peace and Possibilities at the End of Life is written by Dr. Ira Bioch, who's a real spokesperson for the hospice and palliative care movement. He does not believe that people should have to die in pain and die alone. And there's ways to navigate the medical system that, you know, can give people more autonomy and dignity. Atul Gawande is another physician. His book is Being Mortal. He's also extremely informative and talks about how the way we've over-medicalized death. And then B.J. Miller, who we've talked about, went to Princeton University. We love him. He's another physician, a hospice physician. And his book, this book came out not too long ago. It's called A Beginner's Guide to the End, Practical Advice for Living Life and Facing Death. Co-written by Shoshana Berger, I should mention. And this text is for anybody who's kind of just curious. I mean, you don't have to be dying to enjoy this book. Some really great folks have blurbed this book. Elizabeth Gilbert, Adam Grant. You know, I mean, it's a really nice text and can kind of help you see all the things to consider. And I think make it less scary, less mysterious. And not just medically. He talks about all kinds of things, you know, like we were talking about, you know, what to do with your possessions and, you know, all different kinds of things, the whole dying process. The other 2 books that I would recommend are written coincidentally by Buddhist nuns. One is Joan Halifax, and her book is Being with Dying. Being with Dying by Joan Halifax, Cultivating Compassion and Fearlessness in the Presence of Death. And this book, you do not have to, you know, I read this book while my grandfather was dying. So I guess this was technically the first book I ever read about death. But you do not have to be with a dying person or be dying yourself to enjoy this book. It has guided meditations and information about what to expect with the dying process, which I know you were mentioning. You know, we are questions that you have, like awareness. Do people have awareness as they're dying? And then the other book written by Pema Chodron, How We Live is How We Die. So I definitely encourage, and I think these are all actually available on audiobook as well. And I would encourage folks, if you're interested in this topic, just pick one that speaks to you and just see how it goes. You know, give it a try. And definitely if folks are more interested in you talking about this more, I mean, I know you've had an episode on grief recently, hear more about this. I know if folks are interested in learning more, I'd be happy to talk with you more about that if it feels appropriate. Yeah, folks can also find me on Psychology Today. I'm happy to talk more one-on-one with folks about this. I do have a certificate in advanced care planning, which is kind of the, you know, that medical paperwork component of making, you know, designating healthcare proxies and things of that nature. So I'm always happy to walk people through that process because it can be very daunting and we can do it together and make it a little sweeter.
That sounds good. Well, thank you. And I hope I didn't disappoint. I hope this conversation met your expectations, if you had any.
Me or the listener?
You.
Oh.
We will continue.
Yeah.
You
don't ever have to worry about that. Every conversation with you is a joy.
Sounds good. To be continued.
Okay.
Good.